you for joining this webinar. My name is Andrew Campbell-Edie. I'm a Black man in my 50s. My pronouns are he, him. I have shaved hair on my head and a black moustache. I'm wearing a black short sleeve shirt. I'm the communications manager at the Irish Centre for Diversity, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our last webinar of 2023. Just some context to start with. D&I is a constantly evolving and there's no finish line. Intersectionality is one of the next generation areas of D&I that's rising in focus. Today, we're exploring the topic so that you can consider taking a deeper dive and apply any learnings to your organization's work. We're honored to be joined today by a panel of experts on intersectionality, and any of them will be able to help with that deep dive, so please feel free to reach out to them. I've started with introductions to who you can see on your screens. Big welcome to Catherine White. We're very pleased to be joined by her again today for our ISL interpretation. She's fast becoming our in-house interpreter, so she may be familiar to some of you who have joined our previous sessions. Next, I'd like to wish a warm welcome to Jacqui Browne, who's a leading disability advocate, which some of you may be aware of her work, but I'm sure she'll explain more of that when we get going. Next, I want to welcome the multi-award winner, Mamobo Ogoro from GORM. And hello to our very own James Cawley, who's here today in his capacity as a disability activist, rather than speaking on behalf of the Irish Centre for Diversity. Okay, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please do say who you are and where you're calling from, sorry, where you're joining us from in the chat function. Please save any questions for the Q&A function just so that they can be picked up at the right time when we do the Q&As at the end. Today's being recorded, and the recording will be made available later on through our social media channels and through various different communications. So that's it in terms of housekeeping. But before we kick off the proceedings, I'm excited to remind you about our National Diversity and Inclusion Awards for 2024. It's taking place on February the 8th in the brand spanking new Dublin Royal Convention Centre, just behind the Radisson Blu on Golden Lane. Details are now available to view on our website, www.irishcentreforddiversity.ie. I'd like to introduce you to our awards event organizer, Donna O'Connor. Donna will give a quick overview of the categories and the details of how to enter. Over to you, Donna.
Thanks, Andrew, and hello, everybody. Apologies, I've jumped in from my phone today. I think my laptop has overheated, which is definitely a complaint none of us had in July or August. So I'm taking the opportunity to jump on the phone and remind you about the awards. So we launched the call for nominations about 2.5 weeks ago. And as expected, we're seeing a great response across all categories. One of the things I love about the setup of these awards is that we have part 1 and part 2 to the nominations, which allows people to express interest in a category before they actually get all the ducks in a row, craft their best 750 words, agree it with all their colleagues, and then send in the final nomination. So I think today my ask of you is that maybe you start having a look at the part 1 of the nomination and registering your interest in the individual categories, as I say, before you put the work in and get that final great nomination together. As an event organizer, that gives me a bit of an idea as to how many nominations we're expecting, gives me a chance to give the judges a heads up, plan that judging process and any support you might need. As I say, we're seeing quite a lot coming through already, but we do have an 11th category this year, which is piquing a lot of interest. And obviously people who might have entered last year may not be completely familiar with all of the other options that there are available as well. Because obviously, apart from the individual strategy nominations around things like race and ethnicity, disability, gender, there are also opportunities to nominate a leader or emerging leader, an employee of the year. Say the new category this year is social inclusion. We're recognising fantastic employee resource groups. So you may not remember all of the categories from last year. Go online, have a look to part 1, register your interest. As I say, it gives people like myself an important heads up, and then the necessary support will follow. At the very beginning, we had a little bit of a glitch with some of the part 2 nominations. That was due to kind of a firewall issue. No idea what that is. There's a man behind a green curtain somewhere who has now fixed it, and we are back. If for some reason you still have an issue, it could be to do with the cache on the device that you used to make the initial nomination. Just actually contact me. So that's nominations@irishcenterfordiversity.ie, and I'll talk you through it. But we're all good to go. We're looking forward to the nominations, and as Andrew said, we're looking forward to an amazing evening in a new venue. We've got our entertainment already booked, so we're all good to go. I'm nearly at the planning the dress stage.
I was trying to say that I know what my hair's going to look like for the evening, so I'm excited. Thank you, Donna.
Okay, thanks so much.
All right. Okay, so you heard it from Donna, and you're going to hear it from me now. Now, everybody, get those entries and nominations in. God, that sounds very Eurovision. Sorry, I apologize. Without further ado, let's get cracking. There's a lot to talk about on intersectionality. So, I want to start with a definition. So, just so we're clear on what we're looking at today. Jacqui, I'm going to start with you in the hot seat. What does intersectionality mean to you, and how does it manifest in your lived experience?
Okay, intersectionality, it means to me recognizing, respecting, and valuing people who identify with maybe from one or more backgrounds, maybe 3 or 4 backgrounds. So, I am a white woman, I am a disabled woman, I'm a thalidomide survivor, I have a 3rd level education. So I would be identified as somebody possibly middle class. So I have a degree of advantage over maybe some people who don't have the same advantages in life that I've had. Because often we think about intersectionality only in a negative way, but intersectionality is a positive thing too. And this is where we talk about advantage and the disadvantage, because sometimes we think of it only intersectionality as a problem to be resolved. But sometimes we also need to recognize that people coming from multiple identities actually could be born into a world where they're very privileged, or vice versa. They can be born into a world where they're very disadvantaged, purely by where they're born or the family circumstances, or if they're born into poverty, famine, if they're of religion in a country that doesn't understand their culture, their identity, even down to things like the food they eat or the breaks they need. So it's very varied. It's very varied, and it's a very complex area to cover in just 1 hour, really. But so it's about, for me, at the end of the day, it's about recognizing that people have and wear what I call many hats. And I can wear 10 hats in the one day. I might wear none. It depends, maybe the circumstances where I am and who I'm living with, and the social setting or scene, or if it's the professional scene. So we present different faces of ourselves at different times.
That's quite comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. I'm going to switch to Mamobo now, because Mamobo's done a PhD on intersectionality, and I think I may have got that completely wrong, but that's what I've always known you for. As long as I've known you, you've been doing those horrible 3 little letters. So if you could give us the academic definition of, or your academic definition of intersectionality, and then maybe break it down for the uninitiated like me.
Yeah, so I'm so delighted to be here first and foremost, and thanks everyone for joining. My name is Mamobo again. I'm a Black woman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm in hoop earrings and wearing a blue dress that is leopard print, I believe. So my definition of intersectionality, like Jacqui, it is the interconnected ways that our identities and the categories and groups that we belong to reflect the systems or societies that we are in our society, or even our organizational structures, let's say. So like Jacqui was saying, it's the multiple identities and it's the multiple groups that we belong to that reflect into the wider culture that we have as well. So we are not just one identity, and the identity that we have is not chosen by us. A lot of us believe that we choose our identities, but a lot of our identities are placed on the social groups that we are either born into or we choose to enter, let's say, for example, religion. So intersectionality, let's say in a very academic jargony way, is the interconnected way that we have in terms of our identities and how that reflects in the systems and structures that exist in our immediate context. So, for example, like Jacqui was explaining, in, let's say, in a Western world, to be white is to be in a space of position, let's say, a space of positive position, let's say, whereas to be in a disabled body, it's quite different, and you may have a disadvantaged experience because the world is quite ableist, particularly in the Western world as well. So intersectionality is understanding those ways that the different identities that we have connect to who we are and how it's reflected in the wider world around us, and particularly in an organizational setting, it's very important to understand how intersectionality is portrayed not only within your work culture and to how it actually reflects the groups and the teams that you may have in your workplace culture. So it's a huge need that we need to have these good discussions today and understand not only different pockets of identity or different groups that we may have in our workplace culture, but how the interconnectedness of those identities or those groups have and reflect our diversity and inclusion incentives.
Thank you, Mamobo. Now, James, I'm going to turn to you for your input on this, because ever since you joined, well, before you joined Irish Centre for Diversity, I think you were really big on intersectionality, and I remember it being one of your first asks when we first spoke after you joined. So, James, what's your perspective on intersectionality and the definition of it?
Well, thanks, Andrew. I don't know how I'm going to follow that after Jacqui and Mamobo, but I'll give it a go anyways. But hi, everyone. It's James here from the Irish Centre for Diversity. I'm a white Irish male, I have brown hair, and I'm wearing a white shirt, and I'm sitting in my powered wheelchair. I'm also a very proud disabled person. I like to just describe intersectionality very simply as the multiple identities that I have. So I often say when I start a talk or when I'm speaking at an event that I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a husband, I'm a friend, a co-worker, I'm a taxpayer. I'm also a disabled person, and I'm from rural County Longford. All those lived experiences really do shape the experience that I have in everything that I do in day to day, in work life, in my work as a disability activist or advocate as well. And I suppose when we think about intersectionality, I think about identity, and that we must remember that people identify in different ways. And this, of course, allows us to behave in different ways as well. So in many cases, when we're playing out our identity, so for example, when I'm a son, I behave very differently as opposed to when maybe I'm out at an electric picnic having a bop or a dance. So I conform to the different ways, I suppose, that when I'm playing out my different identities. Other things that I think about when I'm thinking about intersectionality is the opportunity to pause and to reflect and to ask questions such as who is in the room, who's not in the room. And sometimes it allows us to think about us as maybe a majority or as a minority, and the differences maybe within our identities or the sameness within our identities, and how that can create conversation, collaboration, and collective action as well. So just one quick example of that, I suppose, Andrew, would be that if I set up an employee resource group in the morning, or a group to untangle an issue or a barrier that somebody faces, you don't want to operate in a silo on its own. You want to communicate what you're doing, because again, I'm not just a disabled person, I'm an intersectional being. And I suppose the key message here is that we're male, we can identify as female, trans, non-binary, disabled. And I suppose my point is that disabled people's rights are women's rights. Women's rights are LGBTQ plus people's rights, and all collectively comes together as human rights. And I suppose that's kind of the cornerstone for me when I think about intersectionality.
Perfect. Okay, now that we're all clear, and I think we are, I certainly am anyway. So I'm going to move on to my next question. And James, I'm going to stay with you. You started to talk about the workplace. I want to kind of take a bit more of a look at that. So my question is, are there challenges to creating a more inclusive workplace? And if so, what can be done to create and nurture a workplace that's inclusive for everyone? So for instance, you talked about women's rights being the same as disabled rights and being the same as then human rights. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks a million again, I suppose. And there's two pieces to that question, I suppose. And like the first piece around it, are there challenges? Of course, there's many challenges, and I suppose that's why we all do the work that we're doing here on this call, and of course, everyone else listening in. But I suppose again, I would view these challenges in general as internal or external challenges. For example, when we think of intersectionality, so internal challenges maybe might be personal challenges, or they could be external in our outward facing life, or indeed internal maybe in the workplace, or external in terms of the broader landscape, for example, with government policies or legislation or structures or systems or cultures or in a workplace setting. But the first challenge that I can think of when I think of this question is, and what can be done is that not everyone thinks in an intersectional approach day to day in work or in a broader societal perspective. And one example that I can think of this, and Jacqui, you're very familiar of this campaign that I worked on and we worked on, and many of us worked on in the disability movement around the issue of personal assistance for independent living for disabled people. And I remember us trying to rally support around legislating right for personal assistance. And the key challenge that we came up against was that I felt I came up against anyways as a disabled activist was that people often said to me, well, that's a disabled person's issue, or that impacts on disabled people. And it was difficult to try and, I suppose, change the way people thought about disability and to change that narrative and to say, well, actually, disabled people are sons, daughters, friends, co-workers, etc. And it impacts on and had a massive voting lobby as well, you know, so they were a massive cohort of society. And it's about making people understand that it's not just a rights issue over there, that it's an issue that everyone can play a part in. And again, I talked about earlier, another example from a workplace perspective is that if we do have, and if we've set up an employee resource group, that they don't just operate on their own, that they do communicate together and do collaborate and say, okay, what are you doing? What can we implement here, etc. Another challenge that I would think about, Andrew, would be that there is sometimes a lack of awareness, maybe a lack of knowledge, but also fear of saying or doing something wrong. And I suppose from an organizational or a workplace perspective, if you don't speak to your employees and you don't know what's going on, then you don't know how to actually implement change to make sure that you can change maybe the culture or something really small, maybe a workplace issue around that maybe you might need flexible working hours to go out to an occupational therapist appointment, or you might be a carer, for example. So I think you can throw all the money you want at initiatives, but it's really important that we have authentic leaders who are going to really engage with people and ask, what can we do to move this on? And I suppose key to that is empathy rather than sympathy. So none of us want sympathy. We want empathy where people can understand us and say, okay, James, what is it that you might need to be your best self at work, to be effective, etc. And I believe empathy as well really is important to allow that understanding for people to be able to understand what their challenges can be. So
So
yeah,
go ahead,
I'll
sorry.
leave it there, Andrew, for the time being, and let
Right.
Jacqui or maybe Mamobo come in as well.
I was going to actually, Jacqui's taken her microphone back on now. So I was going to say, Jacqui, have you got anything to add to that? Because I know that you and James have campaigned together. So in your campaigning work, have you done anything focusing on the workplace that would maybe have some bearing on the question?
I have many years ago. When I was younger, I did a lot of work supporting mostly state agencies or very large corporations in the early days, in the early 90s, 91, 92, 93, when the equality legislation was being spoken about, where I worked with a lot of the agencies and organizations to even put down on paper what an equality policy might look like, and update maybe their employee handbooks and things like that, and do some staff training and all that, and introducing the concept of equal status under the legislation and the early days of employment legislation, and whole concept, particularly from a disability point of view, of this concept of reasonable accommodation, and it's still there, and getting the point across. And this came intersectionality, by the way, not just for disabled people. Sometimes to experience equality, or sometimes to be included in the mainstream of life, you actually have to be treated differently. Okay, so for example, like I use crutches and other technical equipment. So if I want to sit, I might be able to sit in every workstation as a standard space. That's just a very simple example. Somebody else might need, a raised table, these lifting tables. So to achieve and to produce the same output, I get your next colleague next door to you, and you just might need to physically treat it differently, or not only physically. It could be if you're a parent, and I say parent, by the way, not just a male or female parent. You might need to run out to collect the children from school, for example. So can you be accommodated to collect your children from school? And I think if we think about it today in terms of the mainstream, and don't keep focusing on intersectionality as a separate chapter in an employee handbook, look at what happened with the pandemic. Look at how society, and I'd say, just say Ireland for a moment, how we pivoted really quickly. People working from home, all of a sudden MS Teams, Zoom, Canvas, every other technology was made available. People were set up in their homes, after obviously the initial shock and horror and all the rest of it. But society pivoted really rapidly, and so much so today, which is great to see, we now have formal policies for working from home for people. If we had campaigned for that 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, we'd still be fighting about it. But it was enforced upon us. So we can do things, and it makes it better for everybody, for the employers, for the employees, happier companies, happier people, better production, better output, and better atmosphere.
Thank you for that. I guess that goes back to James's mic drop comment about, authentic leadership and empathetic leadership again. So, Mamobo, you're nodding away there. So I guess, I'm coming to you now. I'm not sure if your research has kind of focused on the workplace environment, but I wondered, did you have any, did you find anything specific on intersectionality and the challenges of applying intersectionality to workplaces?
Yeah, I think just touching, I was nodding because I was touching on Jacqui's point, and my research actually does look at how, specifically in the workplace, but the concept of belonging and how it applies to society and institutions, which involves organizations. So when Jacqui was speaking on the point of COVID-19 and how we were kind of thrusted into the world of online working, it kind of was an example of how not only do we need, let's say, the individual campaign, the individual leadership and things like that, we need, let's say, the systemic or the organizational change in this instance to not force people, but entice that change to happen and to create a space of belonging for people with different and diverse identities. So yes, it's very important to do that bottom-up work, and let's say with your ERG groups or with different subsets in your organization as well. But having that top-down sponsorship, the leadership, and then the organizational and cultural change to create an outlook of intersectionality is hugely detrimental when we want to push for diversity and inclusion incentives. So I always argue that people think belonging and creating a space of belonging is very like in your brain, it's kind of airy-fairy, soft skills kind of thing, but it's hugely needed when we want to create a space and an organization that has intersectionality at the forefront. And it's not only an individual, let's say, thing where people have to feel belonging within themselves. It can also be created on an organizational level. And it goes back to the point of what James was saying in terms of speaking to the people that are most affected by certain issues and certain circumstances, using ERG groups as a tool to which you can understand the groups and different and diverse identities that exist within an organization as well. And not only understanding who's not in the room, it's important to see, okay, who's in the room and who's not in the room. But I always argue to also have the question of who is creating the room, who is putting the ideas and building the strategy that we need to build. Questioning those individuals or questioning those whatever you want to look at it, is also important to establishing intersectionality within the workplace. And as we do that, we can actually create a space of belonging for individuals who have intersecting identities. So like going back to the research as well, what I kind of found in my own research, and it looks at the intersecting identities that we look at. My research is in terms of cultural identity. So people that have multicultural identities, let's say, for example, somebody like myself who's Nigerian Irish. So one thing that's very important in establishing a space of belonging for intersecting identities is actually creating a space where their voices are not only valued and listened to when we're in that room, but those voices, or what they actually say when it comes to their intersecting identities, is placed into practice, is placed into policy, is placed into that organizational and cultural change as well. So that's something I just really like to add. Like, not only do we need to think of intersectionality as identities, intersectionalities as individual ways of seeing the world, it needs to be bridged with that organizational and that cultural change in order to move diversity and inclusion incentives forward.
Okay. That was brilliant. I'm going to let you pause and take a sip, because my next question is to you, because it really follows on to the point you were saying about cultural change and all the other things you were talking about in the workplace. So I wanted to kind of take a deeper dive and dig a bit deeper to find out what practical ways can you suggest of embedding an intersectional perspective in the workplace. And you talked about cultural change needed. What behaviors do you think, what behavior changes are needed as well as say policies and procedures? What behaviors are needed to affect that cultural change?
Yeah,
so too much of a mouthful. If you're ready to keep going again.
So I can talk about this for days, so you have to stop me, actually. So my background is in social psychology, so I study behavior on the work that I do. And just to give a bit of context, we definitely need the policies, and we definitely need all the things, let's say, on paper to enact intersectionality in the workplace environment. But I'm of the opinion, this is opinion and this is my bias showing, I'm of the opinion that if you do not have that behavior, that leadership, and if you do not have the people to actually, that have the attitudes and the motivation to actually implement it in an authentic, going back to what James was saying, in an authentic way, and a way that breathes the what you want to do, human rights, inclusion, etc. Those policies and practices are just going to be staying on a shelf, to be honest. So the work we kind of do in our organization is in terms of how we can actually, yes, have the policies, but breathe it in a way that is authentic to those communities that you want to serve, or to the employees that you may have in your organization, and create a culture of belonging as well. So this can be done on a bottom-up level, and the bottom-up level, I believe a lot of you are doing it already, that's in the audience here, in terms of ERG groups, in terms of research within the organizations, surveys, benchmarking, where you can actually understand and what you need to have in terms of diversity and inclusion within the organization. And then on a top-down level, that's more in the area of policy, practicing, organizational change. But for this conversation today, I'm going to be talking a bit more about the let's say bottom-up behavioral level, and that breeds into the top-down approach when it comes to applying those policies and practices. One of my pet peeves when I come into this space, people always ask, first and foremost, what do I need? What are the practical tools? What are the practical skills to, and how do I get the policy into practice very quickly when it comes to enacting intersectionality, or when it comes to breathing a space of belonging in any given environment? I always argue that yes, the practical skills and the quick tips and what I can do now is needed. It's important, but we also need to take a huge step back and understand the behavioral components that are forcing us into this space as well. A lot of times when we're doing the quick tips, practical things, it can sometimes, particularly when you're from a underrepresented community, it can sometimes breed this air of tokenism, and it can sometimes breed this air of, okay, they're doing this just to tick a box kind of thing. And it's that above the iceberg sort of feeling. So I like to say that we need to take a step back and look beneath the iceberg and understand what are first and foremost the attitudes that you have trying to, let's say, create an ERG group, trying to build a diversity inclusion survey, trying to understand the workplace environment. What are the attitudes that are you bringing into the space? Is it external attitude? Yes, you have pressure from your bosses, or yes, you have pressure from the remit that you have to follow, but internally as well, why do you feel that this is important within the workplace culture and environment? And then from the attitudes portion, you need to actually acquire that knowledge to actually build the skills in engaging with different and diverse individuals as well. So this is some of the components that are needed to become interculturally competent and know how to engage with intersectional and diverse environments. You need attitudes, you need knowledge, and then when you get the knowledge, you can apply it with the practical skills of, let's say, empathy building, perspective taking, understanding how to engage with different community based on the contexts that they have as well. So one thing that I argue when it comes to skills and behavioral components in creating a space that breathes intersectionality, not only do we need practical hands-on skills, we need to take a deep dive, let's say, as to our attitudes and to the knowledge that we have of the community around us. And it goes back to what James was saying in terms of acquiring knowledge as to communicating with the individuals that you want to include into the workplace, as to really getting your hands dirty, to be honest, and understanding the way that they're seeing the world to make your organization a more inclusive organization that really breathes belonging as well. And the final point I want to add, because I know I'm taking a lot of airtime, is that when we're creating a space of belonging, particularly for intersectional identities, sometimes these identities are conflicting, and creating a space where cultural diversity and different groups are coming together. I always argue there's this talk that we need to create a safe space. I kind of argue against that. We don't need to create a safe space, let's say. We need to create a safe enough space. So when we have diversity in an environment, of course, and with intersectional identities as well, of course, there's going to be miscommunication. And that's where a lot of that fear is coming from. There's going to be miscommunication. We're going to get things wrong. It's going to be difficult at first. But as you're doing the work to create a safe enough space, it's a space where people can be open and authentic with each other and also engage across those lines of difference. It's going to be uncomfortable to actually have a lot of people from a lot of different ways of seeing the world, backgrounds, ideas, abilities, and things like that come together. And it's not about making a space where everyone feels like they're on holidays or super happy all the time. It's about creating a safe enough space where when we will get it wrong, or when we will make a mistake, they have the confidence and the trust in us to actually open up, particularly when they come from an underrepresented group or underrepresented identity. I'm gonna stop.
Andrew, do you mind if I come in there, if that's okay?
Yeah, I was going to bring you in anyway. I was going to say that's a great point
Yeah.
to bring you in on.
I can't help but think. I know, like, the question was around behavior and embedding that intersectional approach, but I was thinking straight away about the policy versus practice piece. Even, last week there we just seen the review of the Reasonable Accommodation Fund and Disability Scheme, and it was published. And I suppose it was quite clear from that review that we do need support for employers and employees to make the workplace more inclusive for disabled people, but more broadly as well. But I suppose the challenges with these schemes and these programs is that while they're being changed and updated for some years, they sometimes haven't evolved with time or technology or accessibility for so for example, they don't follow the person and they follow the transition, and it would be really important that they do follow James right through his career. So if he does change career, it goes with James, so it follows my intersection, if that makes sense, and my journey. And like a simple thing would be to make it more accessible. Many of these are still in hard copy application process. So an online application process would help that as well, for people to be able to apply for that. But I suppose it's welcome to see that there is the 9 recommendations with that. But I suppose the final thing my point is that it doesn't allude to that it's going to make it more accessible, that these things are going to happen. But to make change happen and to change behaviors and all that, we need steps that are implementable but also measurable. So then we can say, right, this is going to be done in the next quarter or the second quarter or the next year. So then there can actually be implementable steps made forward to make that change happen, if that makes sense. And then of course that will allow behavior to change, culture to change, and allow that engagement to happen as well.
I'm taking so many notes. It's great. Jacqui, just running off that question then, just wondered if you've come across in your campaigning anything that's specific to intersectionality and applying and embedding intersectional practices in the workplace.
Yeah, the thing that I've even myself been involved in, I think it's going back to the policy practice piece, and you're referencing all the time ERG groups, Mamobo, like when we consult and involve people and letting people, employees in this instance, setting the agenda, like, you know, what are the three main concerns that you'd like to trash out, for example? But I think too, because already we ourselves here in this panel, I think there's the potential, we're already trying to address everything as a problem. Intersectionality is a problem. We need to celebrate difference. We need to celebrate cultural identity. We need to celebrate a unique perspective. I mean, even with people, and I saw in one of the questions there, somebody involved in a completely remote working situation, you can still celebrate cultural identity and difference and intersectionality, even online in spaces, or if you're in a physical space. I mean, I've been involved in things like where, as a summer barbecue, an employee-related summer barbecue, everyone was invited, bring something, you know, from your background. You know, if you're, and in particular, there were two Indian people there. They brought some most fabulous Indian dishes. Some other people brought Irish soda bread, you know, and so we had ended up with this potpourri of wonderful food from various nations around the world, and the stories that go with them, and you know, some of the granny recipe or whatever. So, and that's a fun event, and that there's nothing like those kind of events to bring people together and to break down barriers and to create a real sense of belonging amongst employees.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's funny what you said about that whole potpourri and celebrating diversity. My background is from London. I've been in Ireland now for, I think, coming on 15 years. And people always ask me to, they're always asking me to compare London to Ireland and kind of the rural, very rural environment that I live in now in Kilkenny. People are always asking me. And the one thing that I do miss is being on a top deck of a London bus and hearing, you know, 20 different accents and 20 different languages. But yeah, I just wanted to make the point that, yeah, diversity is something that should be celebrated because it all adds to and I know it sounds kind of very soft, but it all does add to the richness of a society. And I suppose we're talking about workplaces here. So it's all about different perspectives. Which is what I guess intersectionality brings in. It brings in different perspectives from different people and adds to the whole. Yeah. Anyway, we're going to move on before I get all airy-fairy and get myself into trouble. Okay, we are running a bit ahead of time, but I'm going to, unless anyone's got anything that they wanted to add before we switch to the Q&As, I'm going to open it up to get to the specifics of, you know, what our audience want to hear. So before we do that, does anybody, you know, James, Jacqui, was there anything you wanted to add to what's been said already, or should we just get to the Q&As? I think okay. I here, bring it on. Okay, I think we're going to do that now. So let me just open up the Q&A function on my screen, and then we can get going. I'm sure there's plenty. I can see there's plenty of questions already in. Right. I'm not going to give names because actually I will. I will give names if you don't mind. So Julie Helen has sent in the question. She wanted to know, as a disabled person, I have really found the awareness extends to disabled people or other intersectionalities themselves. as in I've met a lot of people, myself included, at times have not known what to ask for, have not known what to ask for in terms of support or empathy, or indeed what will be accepted by the organization we may work for. I certainly masked a lot of my needs because I wanted to prove that to prove what I could do, and was too frightened to try to figure out what would make things better. I just wonder if the panel have come across this too. Thanks so much. I already feel understood. So I think that's asking, it's kind of looking at code switching. It's kind of saying, it's kind of taking on board this person is disabled and probably feels that they have to hide the extent of their disability, and maybe have to feel that they have to work twice as hard to be seen at the same level as their colleagues. So their question is, have the panel come across this kind of thing before as well? This kind of code switching and not being your authentic self because you feel that doing so would limit your prospects.
Yeah.
It's a very common
James,
experience,
sorry.
and it would be very, sorry, Jacqui here. That would be a very common experience, particularly of disabled people, and particularly maybe younger people starting out in a career, trying to get a job, and that, and they're trying to they're wanting to fit in, they're wanting to be part of the mainstream, and you particularly find it maybe in very large organisations where there's not great levels of support. They get through the process, and they might even get through the process, and I don't want to name it, they might get through the process even under the disability scheme, and then they're slotted in there's your desk, there's your job, and there's what you do for the day. And that might be the extent, and they may never see a career path, they may never see promotional opportunity, they may never be really included, like things like stupid but really important things. Is the coffee room accessible? Like, I know people who've ended up in offices and there's 2 or 3 steps, and I know that's only talking physical accessibility. Not a mind like people who have communication issues, or people who are deaf and need sign language, and people who need a quiet room, for whatever reason. So I think sometimes we haven't thought through the flow of the workplace, the workspace, and the environment, and I think in order to support someone to ask for support, be that physical support, practical support, or kind of psychosocial, emotional support on site kind of thing. This where something like a good buddy system in the workplace would be great. And good workplaces do have that. And sometimes that could be a very natural kind of buddy system. But you have to be careful too, because some people might like to take over somebody and feel they're taking on a minding duty, and that can become a negative piece as well. So there's a balance to be struck between a buddy and taking over someone's lives or mollycoddling them, if that makes sense. But I think it's a very rational question. I think it's a very fair question. And I think with your own maturity into the job, and I don't mean maturity just as a person, I mean maturity as you grow into a job, become more confident in your work, hopefully your confidence will develop more to be involved. But I do think people like that should be certainly given signposting to support, including people that are there for them.
Hey, James, if somebody, kind of talking around Julie's question now, if somebody is nervous about disclosing their status in the workplace, what advice would you give them if, say, ERGs are not in place, if there's no outward sign of the supports being there? Do you recommend
Absolutely.
disclosing, or do you recommend maybe changing jobs to somewhere where those supports are celebrated and signposted? What?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. Hello to Julie. I know Julie really well, so I'm delighted
Oh,
that she's on the call. And Julie has worked extensively as well in the disabled community and sector. So hello to Julie. I think, in my experience, I've done it both ways. I've disclosed and I haven't disclosed. And again, it's down to a very individualistic lived experience for people, and people don't have to disclose, obviously. But my advice in my personal experience would be I always disclose. And I would have not always done that. So I remember when I was very young, when I was 16, 17, I wanted to work like everyone else in rural County Longford. I was putting out my CVs and I wasn't even getting anything back to say to be called for interview, etc. And it's very disheartening and all of that. But I suppose I went through a period when I did become around that age of 18, 19, when I did link in with my community. And I suppose I grew up very much in a non-disabled world, in the sense that I went to school with lots of non-disabled people who didn't appear to have disabilities. So it was at that point that I decided I needed to actually link with my community, find my tribe really. So I remember linking with an organisation, the Arctic Grey Posters Association of Ireland, which I'm now a member of. And I met with people who were, again, parents who were maybe going through college, who were going through education and work and all of that. And I was able to ask those questions and share and have peer support. So I think peer support for me was the actual turning point where I actually then really changed my identity as well, because I really remember identifying as a person with a disability. I was identifying as having diverse abilities and all these different euphemisms that non-disabled people might use to make them feel better. Whereas now I use, and I proudly say I'm a disabled person, because I know that it's the policy structures and systems and cultures that actually exclude me. And it's the inaccessible building, inaccessible transport, buildings, etc., that do exclude me. So I would say I would always disclose around your disability, because it allows a dialogue and a conversation to happen. And for those who are asking around that piece that Julie alluded to, I think not even in the workplace, reach out to other organizations, disabled persons organizations, which are led for and by and for disabled people, or other disability organizations, or other organizations within the community that you feel your intersectionality is, if that makes sense, to allow you to feel that sense of belonging, to be able to question and challenge things, and actually move forward and have the confidence to go forward and apply yourself in any way.
Thank you. Mamobo, now you don't have to keep your academic hat on, but you can give your lived experience and your, give an agony aunt answer, if you like. How would you advise somebody who maybe is dealing with a workplace? What would your advice be around disclosure?
Yeah, I was first thinking on this question as to like, if it affected, for me and my own personal experience, like James, I started out for example, I'm a queer person, so I just started out not disclosing that at all. Whereas, because I thought that it didn't really affect my work of performance, but then and because I don't have kids and things like that, I didn't see it as it affecting my workplace environment. But on a human belonging sort of things, I needed to understand if the culture I was going into was open to me. Of course, I can always work and it didn't really affect how I work as an individual, but do I actually feel safe enough in this environment? Not really. So I backed out. So I would say disclosing is an important thing, but if you are in an organization where you feel like, okay, or like, let's say, for example, you're HR director and you're like, well, of course we have these things available. But my question is it communicated well to an individual, particularly when they're onboarding, that they can disclose? Because the feeling is that, particularly when you're in that environment, is that there's a fear there and you do not want to make yourself vulnerable when you don't have to. So I would say it's on the onus of, let's say, the people onboarding, particularly at that stage, to communicate that if you need extra supports, or these supports are available to you if you may be of this identity, and really making that crystal clear to an individual and letting them know that if you have that available to you, letting them know the ERD groups that are available, the resources within and outside organizations that may be available for that person to have resources support as well. So like James, my personal experience was that, of course, I can't really hide the fact that I'm a Black person, but when it comes to the queer identity, it's something that I would have not disclosed first and foremost, but it could have put me into a space or a culture that was not supportive of it. So understanding that, and now being in this space as well, it's very important on an individual space to understand what culture you're kind of going into, and understand that it needs to be disclosed in order for you to feel safe enough. There's a lot of work showing that when an employee feels safe enough in a workplace environment, they're more likely to stay, and that goes back to recruitment and retention as well. They're more likely to stay in that environment. So in an individual space, communicating where you need the support in terms of the identities that you may hold. And then for more widely, if you were, let's say, a HR director or a manager, things like that, onboarding a new team member, and you have these resources available, make sure that that communication is crystal clear and open towards that individual, to let them know that these are available to them, and to make them feel that they can trust the culture that they're entering into.
Absolutely. I'm going to throw my own 2p in there as well. I would say what Mamobo's just said talks to completely I've seen some pushback around virtue signaling, which I think is the worst phrase ever. And organizations feeling that they don't want to beat the drum about all the wonderful work they do and the supports that are there. And the best comeback I've seen on that is an individual, a prospective team member or a current team member shouldn't have to ask what the supports are there. It should be made clear what supports there are. To get around basically any reservations they may have around disclosing and asking for the supports to perform better. They shouldn't have to ask what supports are there. The policies should be there and clearly communicated, and the support should be there and clearly communicated. So getting back to Jacqui's question, I guess there's no answer. There's no right or wrong answer. It's what you feel most comfortable doing. Moving on to the next question, then we've got some time left. I have an anonymous question. Person says, I love what Jacqui said about adapting quickly to changes during the pandemic, and it can be done. What advice would you have to give employers who are resistant to maintaining flexibility as we return to post-pandemic working? So lots of things are being rolled back with the kind of return to office. Does anyone have any advice about how that should be handled? And I know that kind of hybrid working model is still being worked through, and people are still, there's no right or wrong way to do it. But Jacqui, what advice would you give in terms of your own perspective on how hybrid working should be handled?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's one easy answer to different size organizations. The nature of the business, involved might require more people involved on site, for example. And so it kind of depends an awful lot on the work and the nature of the work involved. Or are some of the employees that are more office related than practical? And I'm thinking, for example, take a building company. Obviously, the labourers can't sit at home. People who are building houses, building hospitals, building schools. So they need to be on site to build. But people maybe in the support, in the HR function, the finance function, in the procurement function, and purchasing, maybe they can do more hybrid. So there's no one answer to this. But for me, in terms of, I think that employers, if they already have, particularly if they've already accommodated employees during the pandemic to work from home, I think they should still be open to fair and reasonable requests to continue working from home. I really do. And especially where people can establish, or I think the hybrid is good, because I do think actually it's healthy and good for people to go and socialize and meet with their colleagues and to go in and out of the office. I'm not sure that it's 100% healthy to be working from home 365 either, and that's not at all, nothing notwithstanding, doubting work or work output or anything, just the physicality. Don't think from a mental health point of view how healthy that would be either. So I think there's a balance to be struck, but I do think where possible, practical and reasonable, there should be still the option to work from home, or at least in a hybrid fashion.
James, I'm going to come to you now, but you can choose to skip this because we are quite lucky to have flexible working and remote working at the Irish Centre for Diversity. But do you want to add anything in terms of your knowledge of intersectionality, and also in the kind of the work that you're doing with our clients? What approaches have you seen that work really well? Anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think and it sounds so obvious, but I think even that dialogue and that conversation with yourself and your senior manager or senior managers, and seeing again, like what, it starts with a question, like what best works for you, James? And I think I'm very fortunate to be able to, as you say, have flexible working. So it does allow me to nip out to an appointment or to take a rest if I do need a rest period, etc. And like even, we did trial the 4-day week, for example, really worked for me as a disabled person because it allowed me to go and do things that maybe I mightn't get to do, or to have that little bit extra rest, etc. So, and I think it's very much about being able to again being able to talk to your colleagues and let them know what does work best for you, and what is going to work for you, whether it's going to be that you might need a reasonable accommodation or an additional hour off or anything like that. So I think that's just simply put that way, Andrew, that dialogue and starting with a conversation and asking a question.
Thank you. Mamobo?
Yeah, our organization is quite similar to Irish Centre for Diversity, where we're flexible working. Our whole team is remote. We like to call ourselves a COVID baby. So we actually started during COVID-19, so we were forced into online environment. But one thing I would like to kind of question is in terms of, let's say, the manager's perspective, is it that is working online affecting the performance of the team, affecting the outputs that we want to have or the KPIs that we're having? My personal opinion is that if the remote working is, let's say, not affecting the KPIs that we want to reach, the goals that we have for our team, and the team is happy in a remote environment, I would continue that way. If the team is not happy in a remote environment, then we need to have ongoing discussion and really reflect on what are the best ways that we work together, let's say. So for us as a COVID baby, we're just very used to the online environment where we meet on a quarterly basis in person. But understanding the outputs that we want to have as an organization and talking to each other. Sometimes when we're on a remote environment, we just come in, have our meeting, talk about the objectives that we need to talk about, and then done. But actually talking to each other as human beings, like 10, 15 minutes before we actually get into things, can actually help us get that human connection back into the remote working environment. So it's something that we kind of have to force ourselves to do when we're in a workplace, a remote environment, because if you're like in in-person environments, it's something that you just do naturally. But in this remote environment, it's something that you may have to really be targeted and focused on, so we can actually replicate that in that remote environment. But I do agree with Jacqui in the sense that it's not a one-size-fits-all answer, and it's something that you have to have an ongoing conversation with your team and with the people that you are working with.
God, I think you must have been speaking to our leader, our MD, Caroline, because your answers sound very similar. It's focusing on the same things, focusing on the KPI, of course, making sure that flexibility works for everybody and that the business is viable still, as well as all of these wonderful things that we get to enjoy and benefit from. But also your point about before getting down to the objectives of every call, we do still have that space for how are you and some banter and all of those sorts of things. So all those are soft things that are quite essential. We do exactly the same. So I'm sure, I don't know if you were swapping notes with Caroline before, but it's great to see that that best practice is being replicated. I'm going to move on to our next question now. And it's from Michaela Roach. I'm concentrating on questions so far where it's a person, and then I will get to the anonymous ones. But Michaela's question is, I work in a small, just under 50 employees, fully remote company, and we're just starting the process of developing a comprehensive DEI and intersectional process. What might be useful in the early days? Do we need an ERG? How do we maintain authenticity in our approach? So quite a wide-ranging question there, but I think it starts with as a company just starting out on the journey, what advice would you give them about tackling DEI as a whole and also intersectionality? And I know that we've touched on this in the rest of the call, the rest of this session, but Mamobo, if I can come back to you, and if you've had enough chance to kind of grab a drink before that last contribution. But if you've got anything to add to what's been said before on that.
So in terms of the starting out in DEI and building, so I would say conducting activities in terms of DEI is really great, But if you want to think of it in terms of long term, there needs to be a strategy behind it. So to start off a strategy, you always need to have research. You always need to have knowledge. You need to understand, what is my goal? What am I working with? And how, particularly if you're working with a team or with your company, how do the people on my team feel like we can get to that goal? You can think, okay, we can do it this way, but we need to really deeply understand, how do the people that we're working with want to get to that goal? And having a strategy behind any diversity inclusion incentives goes back to the point of not being tokenistic, but making it into a way that can actually really build it and make it as a bedrock into an organization as well. So I would say, when you're starting off, it's great to just have ongoing engagement in terms of events, in terms of, like Jacqui was saying, in terms of cultural events and understanding the diversity and differences that are going on, just to keep people motivated and keep people seeing on an outward facing thing that, yes, we're taking diversity and inclusion and we're starting it in our organization as well, but to really embed it into the core of the organization through an intersectional perspective. A strategy needs to be implemented. And to start off a strategy, we need to understand what we are working with, how we need to, what we want to get to, and what is the roadmap as to how we can get there as well. So that's kind of some of the main points I would say in terms of if you're first starting off in the diversity and inclusion world.
Great, thanks, Mamobo. Jacqui, I'm going to come to you, and I'm also going to tie in another question that I've seen, which I think fits quite well together. So Michaela, another part of Michaela's question was, how do we maintain authenticity in our approach? And then we have an anonymous question that asks, how do we encourage empathy and understanding on the importance of belonging amongst leadership? So how do we develop inclusive leadership, but also maintain authenticity in work around D&I? If that question's not too far, too wide, Jacqui, I wondered if you...
No, but I can certainly give some perspective, particularly maybe from the world of disability. I think being authentic closely relates to some of the earlier discussion, particularly that you were referencing, Mamobo. Tokenism comes across very quickly. It's very easy to spot, particularly if you're the subject or the receiver of the tokenism. And James and I would have many years of experience, and just purely based on chronological age, I have a lot more experience of him, of tokenism. And right from sitting on a committee, you're there because the disabled tick box nominee. Now, you might not be informed, you not be empowered with information, you might be sitting around a table and you're on this committee, but you might not understand the history or what the committee is about, or have a sense of the journey that they're trying to take. And that's a very simple example. So if you're thrown into the middle of something, but you actually haven't been informed and enabled to participate and given the capacity to participate, well then, obviously, that's a tokenistic approach. So for me, being authentic means, well, do you really want the person to be involved? Are you genuinely including them for their perspective? Are you respecting their individuality? Back to the very start, where your very first question, Andrew, where you asked about defining and identifying what intersectionality means. So, it's about respecting the individuality of identity, or multiple identities, as the case may be. So for me, that's what authenticity is, coming through and coming across as being genuine. And also, I think leaders also, you're a leader, but you don't have to know everything. That's the difference between being a boss and a leader. A leader also wants to grow, learn, and inform their own journey. So for me, that's what this classic style of being a leader. I mean, you could have a whole other discussion on leadership versus chairmanship versus being a boss versus, the different styles of leadership. So true leaders will never know everything, because I'd hate to think that I'd ever know everything. It'd be a very scary world to be living in. We are continually learning, evolving, and being allowed even to maybe change our opinion about something that we held maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, because we've been informed and empowered by meeting more people, by meeting other people with different perspectives. Oh yeah, I never thought of that. So for me, that's authenticity, listening and being close to and time too. Sometimes I think sometimes we get so focused maybe on the KPI, so focused on the outcome, and at the end of the day, I appreciate not all obviously, but an awful lot of employers, their bottom line is profit. Their bottom line is the balance sheet at the end of the year. So that's their focus. Now, how the journey you get to that, and the how the one good KPI that I always think for leaders to look at is what are your retention rates like, or have you got a massive turnover in staff? Because if you have a massive turnover in staff, that's really speaking to you. That's saying something to you. But if you have great staff retention, and even better, if you've got career progression or mobility within the organisation, that's even better KPI output. So they're the things as a leader you should be looking for. How we're retaining people and growing people and empowering people to want to work in this organisation. And in fact, to not only to work in it, but to love the organisation, to speak about it. So that's, for me, they're kind of the elements I would speak to.
So many mic drops in that, Jacqui.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
No problem.
James, kind of on a related question, I wanted to direct Nikki O'Hanlon's question at you. And remember, you're speaking in your own terms rather than as a member of the Irish Centre for Diversity, so you can answer this however you like. Nikki asks, how do we make the case for leadership to resource DEI appropriately in terms of money and people? And I guess that talks to, the three cases that we always turn to. And before you start, I would say at the Irish Centre for Diversity, we were quite lucky to work with partners and clients that already understand the benefits of progress on D&I. But use that as your jumping point, James.
Very good. Well, I suppose, Andrew, when I'm thinking of that question straight away, so how do we make the case for leadership to resource DEI appropriately? I suppose again, there has to be a reason, I suppose, as to why. So even starting out with leadership, I suppose looking at what are the characteristics maybe of an inclusive leadership, or an inclusive leader. And what comes to mind for me straight away is a Gold client that talked about on the Journey to Gold webinar before, where they said that they had this idea, not just specifically leaders, but where people came together, and it touches on what Jacqui talked about earlier on, and Mamobo as well, around even having a World Cafe, for example, and coming in to discuss, a topic during the work time, by the way. And I know there was somebody saying there remotely as well. That could be done online as well, where maybe there is a topic that's taken into consideration to discuss it and to move that forward. And I suppose when we start to delve into a topic like today, for example, I suppose we inevitably get an impression of the topic area, and we might think, that we're now introduced to it. We might experience something that's familiar with ourselves. We might get a little bit of commonality or similarity, and allows for that sameness, but also connection then. And I think when that connection happens and they can see how that can impact on the organization going forward, that can allow collaboration and then doing that. So I suppose starting out very simple around, looking at your resources, is there lived experience, what lived experience is in the organization, and then seeing can they lead a conversation along with the leader. And then of course they can reach out then to see if there's any maybe training or external supports that they can get that can feed into that business, moral and legal case as well.
Thank you for that, James. Very well handled. I have let the conversation run on, so I really have to wrap it up now, because I know that everybody's time is precious. So we are coming up to the quarter two mark. So I want to wrap up, and I'll start by doing that by saying a massive, huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Catherine for the ISL interpretation. Thank you to our backstage team for keeping it all flowing well. And thank you to you, our audience, for registering today. Once again, I remind you that the recording's available. In terms of takeaways, I personally took so many notes, and God, it just reminded me of how bad my handwriting is. But key things that I've picked out are focusing on intersectionality allows the pause to check who's in the room, which is obviously very key when looking at the whole area of D&I work. Another thing that I've starred in my notes is, focus on who's not in the room. and focusing on intersectionality allows the silos to be broken, the silos that D&I work usually sits within. It breaks all of that down. Authentic and empathetic leadership is key, and I know that we've covered that just recently in the Q&As, and to really drive home that point. Cultural change is also key in looking at intersectionality, and there are so many more. I will end now by saying that the recording will be available to you, so please do go back and run through it again and take your own notes and pick up any points that you may have missed. Please reach out to our team of panelists. They can be found on socials, through email, I'm sure through Googling. So if there's anything that you wanted to take a deeper dive on, please do reach out. I'll end by giving another reminder about the National Diversity and Inclusion Awards. Entries are open now. The closing date for entries is the 20th of October. Please do get them in. And as Donna said at the start of this, please do fill in Part A just to register the interest so that we know that you're thinking about it. Follow us on our social media. We're available on LinkedIn, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or X as it's now called. Please keep up to date on all our events. Register for our newsletter to be notified of all our events coming up in the new year. And we look forward to seeing you again in 2024. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.